Last time we left off with the world at the brink of war. And as it turns out, contrary to many people's expectations, it was much worse and much more prolonged than ever before. So much so that Europeans call this the Great War, not knowing there was another one to come, unfortunately. But as we get to this war, there's a lot of film that you can watch, especially as we reach the 100-year anniversary of the First World War. Go on YouTube. There's a lot of it out there, both in actual film, in documentary, in clips, in reviews. But go and check it out on your own time. You could probably find a lot that is there, some of which is a little bit more on the gory, on the violent side that we can't show in school. But if you find them, many of them are done very, very well. So I do encourage you to go ahead and take a look at them because this war is one whereby it's unexpected that uh, the the gore and the bloody nature of this war is going to come to fruition in such a manner. So we're going to review some of that in a bit. But first of all, let's go ahead and do some quick review on why that is. So the first review question is to examine how the Industrial Revolution changed the nature of warfare. It's a question we looked at a previous lecture. So go ahead and pause the video right now, do some review if you need to, and answer review question number 1 in the Google Doc. All right, hopefully you've paused the video and you've come back after answering this first question. And in a lot of ways, what the First World War produced was a new type of warfare that really technically wasn't new. It had gone on a little bit during the American Civil War, during the Crimean War, and so forth, but partially because traditional tactics of mass infantry, so in other words, put everyone together and have this immense amount of firepower that you are able to produce through mass infantry. That doesn't work anymore when the firepower becomes overwhelming. And so much so that the repeating rifles, the machine guns, the large artillery pieces, small mortars that you can take with you, all of these things are going to put the defensive up on a pedestal. In other words, the defense is always going to win when you can produce so much firepower. There's little an attacking force can actually do. And so, therefore, the only way to protect yourself, especially after all of the protective barriers have been destroyed by um, the fighting, is to dig down. Okay, so all of a sudden now, tens of thousands of foxholes becomes a series of trenches, whereby armies will come out of them, attack the other side, get decimated, pull back, and you repeat that process over and over again. And this is what frequently many people call a war of attrition. And a really good example of this by 1916 is in the famed Battle of Verdun, whereby the German High Command, in a lot of ways, has given up the traditional tactical aims of capturing major cities and so forth. Instead, it's a strategic aim of trying to get France to exit the war by political means. And the strategy in Verdun was to, quote, actually to bleed the French white, whereby they're going to lure the French into this battle, kill as many as possible, and demoralize the French cause enough for them to sue for peace. Didn't quite work as Germany sort of fell into their own trap, trying to regain ground back and forth, so much that 1 million casualties had occurred for practically no gain on either side. The French are going to claim victory because they're able to recapture Verdun, but really it was just a whole lot of bloodshed for nothing. In 1916, and what becomes known as the Battle of the Somme, the British Army had actually held back many of its early draftees and younger men for an offensive that they had hoped would win the war. And in 1916, they were able to do so. 2 weeks of massive artillery bombardment, and when the troops were sent over the top, it was a massacre. 58,000 casualties in the first day for really limited gains. Only a few sectors were able to actually capture the objectives. From then on, it just became a slog of battles between the Western Allies and Germany. 600,000 British and French casualties for about 12 kilometers gained on the ground, which is a little bit something, but it's not the decisive war-winning victory that you would expect. Not only that, but it was an environmental disaster as well. I mean, think about the effects of an industrial war, right? Especially in the second phase of the Industrial Revolution, where you're dealing with chemicals and all sorts of other stuff necessary to create stuff that kills people. And so it would have enormous environmental effect. In fact, some people may still be dying from the First World War as a result of unexploded weapons and so forth that have been unearthed in recent years. There are other examples of this. In the Battle of Ypres, which is a town in southern Belgium, there were 3 battles that took place all along the same front. Imagine going in 1915 and seeing the wreckage and the ruins of a battle that had been fought a year ago, and then 2 years ago at Passchendaele, where many actually had to fight literally in the mud in order to try to advance to enemy positions. There were cases in this battle and others where soldiers who were carrying these really heavy packs would actually die of drowning. Right, they'd slip off and then fall into the water. They can't get up, and no one else can pull them out in the mud. And next, they've died of drowning in trench warfare. It's crazy. All the while in the 3 Battle of Ypres, about 850,000 casualties. I mean, we're getting to these numbers where it's even hard to imagine the size and the scope of these particular battles. Here's the town of Ypres at the beginning of the war, and right at the beginning of the war, and then here's Ypres again afterwards. You can see sort of everything that's been constructed has been destroyed here. Another example is the Battle of Isonzo, which is in Italy. Now, Italy itself was actually aligned with in the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. However, when the war began, Italy decided, no, we're going to wait, and we're going to back out and basically go to both sides politically and say, hey, you know what? Hey, if you offer us more, we'll join your side. And as it turns out, Italy flips over to the side of the Allies with Britain and France, and launches an offensive against Austria-Hungary. A problem with that is that the border between Italy and Austria-Hungary just happens to be the Alps, and the very small passages that is necessary to go into Austria-Hungary were easily defended. So it's like trench warfare, except in the mountains. You can imagine the results. About 10 to 12 battles were fought here, depending on which historian you ask, leading up to about 1.2 million casualties, of which in the end Italy loses ground and loses territory to German and Austrian offensives. And so if we can define the Great War as this stalemate called trench warfare, so all of these new weapons that were so effective in creating these global empires, all of a sudden when they're actually turned against one another, it's this disaster that neither side can push forth. There are other possibilities, using again the advances in the Industrial Revolution, the usage of chemicals, poison gas in order to attack the enemy, which is partially successful. Problem is, the one thing about gas is you can't control the wind. Submarine warfare, as it turns out, becomes a little bit more decisive, but not in the way that the practitioners of the submariners thought they would. It would turn against Germany more than it actually would turn against the Allies, and we'll get to why so in a moment. There are also new technologies, communication through telephone, through Morse code, through radio, such that commanders in the rear can communicate supposedly with soldiers in the front, and also a preview of the 2 more decisive factors in the coming war, not this one, the coming war. The first usage of aircraft, first for aerial reconnaissance to spot out the enemy, and then eventually as a tool to attack not just other aircraft, but perhaps even enemy ground forces, and then the notion of armored vehicles, armored personnel carriers, and what eventually will be called tanks. So you put these tractor-like vehicles, put some guns on them, and see what could happen. But like many of these early mechanical devices, they will be somewhat useful, but they're just not as reliable or effective at just this juncture in time. So therefore, in what is called the Western Front, again, sort of the theme of this lecture is that this is global warfare in a total war. And so, yes, there's stalemate on the Western Front, but there could be possible other outlets where this war could be won. And this is particularly shown in the East. So we're going to go to our first break right now and take a look at a quick review on Russia. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video right here. Go to your textbooks, page 662 to 664, the parts where it discusses Russia, and do a change in continuity over time question here and answer this between 1860. So you're going to have to talk about the initial condition of 1860 and the changes that have come about in 1914. So go ahead and pause the video right here and answer this particular question. Guys, our next review question, you're going to go ahead and go to pages 691 and 700 and find the parts about Russia once again. And some of it may be about Russia, some of it may, you can go ahead and take the content and be able to apply it to Russia as a growing industrial society. Explain some of the issues that the Russian Empire specifically had at the outset of the Great War. So right about 1914, what are some of the problems it's having, particularly within its industrial cities? Go and spend a moment, pause the video, go into your textbooks and find the answer as best as you can. Go and do that right now. All right, welcome back, guys. And so one of the outcomes of what becomes known as the Eastern Front in the First World War was that this, in a lot of ways, in some ways, is a very, very different war and very different combatants as well. Now, initially, the Austrian invasion of Russia was halted, and it turned out the Russians mobilized their forces faster than anybody could have imagined. Okay? And Austria, however, started the war by attacking Serbia, but it would take almost a year for them to be successful. And Serbia itself was completely isolated; it was landlocked. There was no way it could have gotten help from the Western Allies, and so many thought it would fail and fall within a few months. But they lasted for well over a year and continued to fight throughout the um, entirety of the war. Russia, however, ends up invading particularly Prussia, which is basically Eastern Germany, modern day Western Poland. And it looked like it was going to have a major effect on how the outcome of the war. But because it lost some of the early parts, some of the major battles to the Germans, it resulted in a stalemate for the next coming years, albeit not the type of trench warfare that you saw in the West, but the Russians could not break through, and year after year after year, they could not do so. There are offensives that were planned were planned. There were attacks. There were some initial successes, but every time they attempted to further invasion of Germany and Austria, it would not succeed. And so, as a result of this, Russia becomes the first state. And so, you can imagine if we were to really put everything together here. These industrial states are pulling everything they have into this war, like changing their economies, drafting men left and right, and it now becomes this battle. We talk about the term stalemate. This becomes a battle of who is going to fall down first. In other words, which country, if they can't win by knocking each other out, which one is going to literally implode first? Which industrial state just simply can't hack it, can't handle it, and they're just going to simply lose out. And it turns out that is Russia, one of the late industrial powers, and they are the first ones to crack. And in February of 1917, groups of citizens, many of which were industrial workers who have not been paid, who have not been fed well, other soldiers in the cities, they end up rebelling against the Tsar, and they're going to make a push that has been happening since the end of the Russo-Japanese War and the establishment of a constitutional style government, whereby they're going to implement some democratic ideas into the war. And so Russia becomes a republic for a few short months, albeit probably the decision that they continued on with was to actually continue the war itself here. The Tsar himself would be overthrown and eventually put under house arrest for their own protection, because by the end of 1917, as the war continues and it doesn't improve, there's a second revolution led by the communists, particularly an individual by the name of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who leads a communist revolution. He was actually in exile in Switzerland at this point, and a German bureaucrat came, and I'll get to him in just a moment, Arthur Zimmermann, comes up with this idea that basically says, hey, let's go ahead and ship Lenin back to Russia, so maybe he's going to stir up some kind of revolution. But the problem is this, is that there is a working class in every single country. So it's almost as if saying, I'm going to try to start a fire in my neighbor's house, hoping that, hey, the fire's not going to jump to mine. And that's really, really dangerous. But in some ways, Zimmermann succeeds in this way, in that Lenin successfully leads the communist revolution. He and the other radicals within the Communist Party, this group called the Bolsheviks, end up signing a separate peace with Germany in 1918. And it ensues in a massive civil war where millions will be killed due to warfare. and also starvation as well. From 1917 all the way to 1923, eventually the communists are going to hunt down the Tsar and his family. They're going to assassinate the entire family, and this war is going to continue even well after the First World War ends. The Allies get into the picture. Americans, the British, and others are going to send troops to support the pro-monarchist or pro-democratic forces known as the Whites. But eventually it is the Reds, the communists, that will win out and establish the first communist state and killing the Tsar and ending the Romanov dynasty. Maybe if you've heard of or seen this film here, there were some rumors that one child from the Romanov family, Anastasia Romanov, may have survived, and this becomes a really popular Western story that probably wasn't true. They may have found her body separate from the graves of some of the others who were killed by the communists. Okay? But either way, as we look at fighting the Great War, Russia itself collapses in the Eastern Front, okay? But that's not the only place where this war is fought. Okay? Over colonies, okay? There are cross-border conflicts between the Germans, between the British, and so forth. So from German East Africa, there's invasion of British lands and territories as well. So there's combat in the African continent by colonial forces, and also there is a war in Asia as well, particularly because of the ambitions of Japan. Japan takes this opportunity to join the Allies and actually take as many German overseas possessions as possible. But an activity that we had done previously was about migration across this now globalized world and society. And so there is combat on the high seas from naval forces attacking not only battleships and cruisers, so military equipment, but also civilian transports as well that are sunk by ships and also by this new weapon called submarines. Okay. One group that joins into the Great War and will play a major role in what's to come is the Ottoman Empire. Okay. The Young Turks, which has seized power, so again, this modernization movement that's gone on in the Ottoman Empire by the turn of the century, they decide particularly as a way to get back at Russia and to take advantage of the weakness of Russia, they decide to join the Central Powers to maybe be able to seize some of the lands that they had lost to the Russians in previous wars. Okay? All the while, the British will see this as a potential opportunity to go ahead and end the war in a different way, to not only supply Russia with material, but then also to open up a separate second front, whereby they might be able to go into Austria-Hungary from the south instead. And so in doing so, they tried to capture the key city of Constantinople and Dardanelles Straits. An idea coming from perhaps the Lord Admiralty, the head of the Navy at this point, Winston Churchill, the Australians and New Zealanders, so again, we talk about these global empires that would fight on behalf of their imperial powers, were sent to try to take this key possession here, and they end up failing due to some of the leadership, and not only that, but the bravery of some of the Turkish and Ottoman soldiers, led by individuals like Mustafa Kemal, who we'll discuss at a later point. And he and others were able to repel the British invasion of the Ottoman Empire. But where the British was successful is sort of the outskirts of the Ottoman that were already on the verge of uprisings. And so the British went to the Arabs in the Middle East to encourage revolt in 1916 in exchange for their independence. But yet, at the exact same time, the British are going to some of the key industrialists and some of the key leaders who happen to be Jewish in what becomes known as the Balfour Declaration, whereby the British are already starting to think about after the war, when the Ottomans are defeated. You can imagine the Ottoman Empire will break up and new states are going to develop at this point, that perhaps a new Jewish homeland, this group that has been persecuted by Western Europe and Eastern Europeans for generations upon generation, would be given their own homeland in the Middle East, back where their traditional kingdoms were in Palestine, which has been a key part of not only the Ottomans, but also the various Islamic caliphates as well, as we go all the way back to the post-classical period. And so these two are going to contradict themselves here. So what the British are going to do, we'll take a look at that at another time. Okay. So just as a quick recap of this Latin previous section here, based on the material you found, explain one political change that may or has come about. So again, that you predict may happen or has already come about based on what we've discussed here as a result of the First World War. So what particular political change will happen or may happen as a result of the First World War. So go and pause the video here, go and answer question number 4. Okay, hopefully you guys are back. And let's go ahead and wrap this up here. Now, a consequence of the Ottoman Empire entering into the war was that they feared that a minority group of what are known as Christian Armenians. The Armenians are here. They live mostly in the borders of northeastern Turkey and southern Russia. That this particular community, known as a millet community. So in other words, this is a group that has had autonomy. This is one of the independent religious group that the Ottoman Empire has always granted over time, as long as they pay the jizya, the religious tax. They could really be an independent community. That this group was actually helping Russia. Okay, and this is what, and with that justification, because they were seen as a threat in the Russian war, in a war against Russia, there's this feeling that they needed to be taken care of. And so as a result of this, many of the Armenians were sent into a forced migration that ended up killing thousands and eventually more that were massacred in a number of concentration camps. Now, this is one of those really controversial things that the modern country of Turkey says, no, it never happened, or not to the scale that people are saying. But there's more than enough historical evidence to show that hundreds of thousands, maybe about 1 million people would die. And many in this modern day call this one of the first genocides because it targeted a particularly ethnic religious group in the Ottoman Empire, where there were these death camps, not necessarily in the way of the Jewish death camps in the Second World War, but these concentration camps that would kill many. So that's an unfortunate consequence that we have here. But another way that this war is a global war is just simply the number of men all over the globe who would fight this war on the West. This on not just the Western Front, but all over the globe. This here is one of my favorite pictures here. The Sikh soldiers from India who end up fighting on the Western Front here as members of the British Empire. There's actually a cemetery in Belgium to commemorate their sacrifices in this war as well. 800,000 were mobilized in Japan. 600,000 from Canada, and so forth and so on. So this is a global war. But what turns the tide of this war, not to be such an American exceptionalist, but it is the United States that is going to play a role in ending this war. Because by 1917, so again, Russia has already imploded upon itself here. But by 1917, every country is dealing with war weariness. In France, they're dealing with mass desertions, where they would have to execute some soldiers to try to make a point, make dramatic reforms. Major reforms would happen, particularly for the working class in Great Britain, in order to prevent strikes and other things during a critical time in war. The working man actually, and women in some cases, actually gained some benefits in order to avoid labor disputes. But it is by 1917, all sides are now at a point where there's a manpower shortage. And so it is the American entry that's going to play a major role and impact on the outcome of this war. And how did Americans get into this conflict? Well, in 1916, President Woodrow Wilson had actually won re-election based on the slogan, "He kept us out of this war." The Americans saw themselves as, look, this is another European conflict. We don't need to get involved. We can continue to trade goods and items and enrich ourselves in the process, but we're not fighting this European war. That is until Americans start to die, including those on ships like the Lusitania, which was a British ocean liner, which was sunk by German submarines because it did have in its cargo hold some weapons on board, but there were also a few hundred Americans that would perish as a result of this ship going down. And it's going to create an outrage in the United States and further the push for war. Not only that, but Arthur Zimmerman, the man that we had mentioned previously, came up with another idea, whereby with the expectation that America would join the war on the side of the Allies. He sent the message over to to Mexico, basically saying, "Hey, if you join Germany, hey, you join our side, hey, against the Americans, we're going to help you to recover some of your land that you lost, New Mexico, Texas, and so forth." Here, now, the reality of that happening, probably nil to none, right? But this message was intercepted by the British, and they were quite ready to hand this over to the Americans, broadcast it out in a newspaper, and say, like, "Hey, look what we found." And the United States by 1917 declares war, and by 1918, because the U.S. was quite unprepared for this war, it's going to take them some time to move into a war setting, to change their consumer industrial society into a war manufacturing society. About 2 million would arrive by 1918. Okay? This is perfect timing because the German armistice in 1917 meant that the Germans could take their last reserves fighting on the Eastern Front, launch offensive in the West. That, as it turns out, was stemmed by not just the bravery of French and British troops, but then also by the newly arrived Americans as well. And from there, the last gasp of the German offensive meant that the Allies could finally move and start to push the Germans further out of France and Belgium, such that by 1918, there were enough rumblings within Germany. They've been blockaded. People are starving or near starvation levels. And there's this sense that this war can't go on forever. And so there were enough feelers to call out for an armistice. And eventually there's a revolution within Germany itself here and an overthrow of the Kaiser, leading to eventually by November of 1918, with the army still active in France and Belgium, by the way. So Germany has not been invaded. An armistice was negotiated and signed in November 1st of 1918. But the end result is massive. Okay, we're looking at a huge chunk. And think about the number of men that were mobilized, and not only that, but a huge percentage that would be wounded and killed in this conflict. Look at it, particularly Germany, France, whereby look at the number mobilized and look at the number that are wounded as well. Okay, so these charts and these graphs demonstrate just how vicious this war was and how destructive it was in regards to human life. Okay, the war ends. Okay, and thus starts the negotiations, a number of different treaties that will come together between countries, but the largest one occurs between Germany and the Western Allies. And all of this was negotiated in that old traditional palace in Paris, in the Palace of Versailles. And it was actually dominated, as it turns out, by really three individuals. Georges Clemenceau of France, who called for a buffer zone between Germany and France. David Lloyd George of Great Britain, whose aim was to weaken the German Navy and to ensure that Germany would never contest British naval and colonial power ever again. But there's also Woodrow Wilson. He is, in a lot of ways, the positive factor in this. He's not there to exact material from the Germans. Instead, he's there to make true the slogan that he's been going for in the last few years, and that this is the war to end all wars, right? That there's a reason for this, that they would be the arsenal for democracy around the world. And so what he's calling for is that this war would be for the sake of self-determination of people groups. Okay, that people can determine their own fate, create their own country, because that's in a lot of ways why this war began, right? The Bosnians and the Serbians trying to voice their own nationhood. Okay. However, there are underlying problems that have racked the industrial world for the previous century that continue to be ignored. One was Japan's call for racial equality, that they would be an equal partner in the peace process, which they were not. Japan called for racial equality. People didn't want to buy this at this particular time, particularly in the Western world, because that would mean letting go of some of their colonies if they're going to call for true equality. So instead, they went to Japan and said, you can have the racial equality thing, or you can have some territories in China. Okay. Japan called for the territories. Okay. W.E. Du Bois, an American who called for a representation not just of African Americans, but Black Africans as well. His voice was pushed aside. There was the claim of the Arabs for independent nationhood, not just in what we know today as Saudi Arabia, but the rest of the Middle East as well. Instead, his claims would also be pushed aside, and that promise to the Jews, okay, from the Balfour Declaration would also be pushed aside as well, and any calls for justice for the Armenians who were massacred in Turkey in the Ottoman Empire at this time was also ignored as well here, with the focus being on what can these two countries do about Germany and whether or not there is going to be the creation of this, what we call League of Nations, that the countries of the world would come together for cooperation as such. So you're going to take a look at in the last activity here, pieces of the Treaty of Versailles, highlighted some elements and answered the questions that are provided. Okay, but one last part. Okay, so you're going to evaluate this. I also want to be able to introduce now what you're going to do in a subsequent assignment, because if you can imagine a situation where you're kicking a man while he's down, well, that's what happens to the world in 1918. In that, in 1918, there was a different war of a different kind, and one that here in 2020, it is the news of the present day, and that would be an influenza pandemic in 1918 and 1919. So we're going to go ahead and examine through a practice DBQ, how states responded to this global pandemic. Because again, when we're talking about a world that is now connected, we get an industrial world of migration of people's goods and items. But yet at the exact same time, when there is a disease, it's going to spread. And what sort of response we're going to take a look at in this particular DBQ. All right, with that, go ahead and finish up this last section, and I'll catch you next time.